Hello, 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 spooky people. We are back. I'm Advent Nebula.
And I'm Cruellica Kain.
And today we're talking about a little more in depth on some of our favorite horror movies and just how different some of our tastes are and how much they overlap.
And in a way, how they made us who we are. I kind of feel like for me, because I am super OG. Not to say you aren't, but I started my horror journey when I was 4. I kind of feel like horror molded me into what I am. Because if not for having all of these horror movies, I don't think I'd have the humor I have, the tastes in manga, anime, and other pop culture. And admittedly, I have to say, as a woman, I'm incredibly broken because horror ruined me from enjoying anything rom-com or girly movies. Like, I was never in that whole Twilight craze. I read the book just because I like to read, and it was a terrible book, but I never even got into like 50 Shades of Grey because I feel like horror taught me to respect, even though I watch some really bad horror. But with that said,
We both do.
I think horror kind of makes me who I am. But how about you?
So, I grew up in a household where my father, very much into sci-fi. So, my earlier horror experiences were Alien and The Thing. And that's probably why I'm such a fan into the psychological and the body horror stuff, because I ended up getting into Cronenberg in my late teens. And nowadays, well, I'm not watching like the more psychological horrors. I enjoy straight up body horror or H.P. Lovecraft style horror genre.
So for me, I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but for anyone who has not heard or is new, my favorite, or my first horror movie that I ever watched, super, super young, was Nightmare on Elm Street. And it wasn't like my mom sat me in front of the television and had me watch the movie. That was the babysitter. But still, my cousin Jason, his girlfriend, really liked horror. And not that they're bad. I actually wasn't afraid of Nightmare on Elm Street compared to other movies that I really enjoy. But for me, because of that, and because of just things that happened in my childhood and things like that, I've always enjoyed haunted house movies. So, especially when you go into The Haunting, or The Haunting of Hill House, or any adaptation of that. Ghost stories have always been huge for me. I've always loved ghost stories, and I can also credit that to something non-movie related. So in the one house that we lived in back in New York when I was a kid, one of my neighbors brought me a bag of cassette tapes. If you don't know what cassette tapes are, look them up. They were awesome.
Until you had to use a pencil.
Until you had to use a pencil to fix them. But it was a bag of cassette tapes of old radio shows from the 40s and 50s. One of them was called The Whistler. And another was called Inner Sanctum for these series. And listening to scary stories through audio versus a movie changes your perspective.
And for me, I think it's just because it's my fact of what I like to read now as an adult, and even as a young adult, late teen, I enjoyed sci-fi and the more supernatural, psychological horror stuff. And sci-fi horror has always been something that's interested me. So it's that unknown factor. And for the body horror, I think it just started just because I saw Scanners and Videodrome, and I just went from there and just Cronenberg's catalog, and then gone on to just any other kind of body horror. a lot of people are kind of cringe on this, but Martyrs is probably one of my favorite of the modern body horror films.
Well, I actually have to admit, for me, I am starting to have a very special place in my heart for modern found footage films. And I'm not talking about the Paranormal Activity movies. They have their own fan base. I have seen them all. I've seen them all multiple times. But with like the VHS series,
which are all very well done for shorts that tie together the one longer narrative.
Absolutely. Especially when you get to VHS
1994.
94. Oh my God. And I watched that on Shudder. So I watched the first VHS movie and I'm like, this is okay. The second VHS movie was beyond incredible. And then when they just released 94...
which probably has the scariest one with the dog man in it.
Oh, God, yeah.
Because it's not a werewolf. It's the cryptid dog man in this one short that creeps you the fuck out.
Well, and they, like you said, they all intermingle. They all connect in, like, a very obscure way.
And there's an overlying story going on with all these tapes that you don't really realize until the fourth, which is VHS 1994, and how they all connect to each other.
And it's impressing me because I hated Blair Witch when it came out.
And if you didn't know, a lot of those stories in the VHS movies started from creepypastas like the Slender Man story, but VHS took a new spin on them.
Which I appreciate that. I love the creepypasta aspect because, like, Slender Man is not huge to me. The sad controversy of those two teenage girls attempting to kill their best friend, that's been more fascinating for me because I like true crime, but just how it affected the mental health of individuals.
And then what VHS did is inspired from creepypasta stories on Reddit. They were like, let's take these ideas, expand on them, get with the guys who anonymously posted these stories if they could, and then they made a whole franchise out of it. And it just blows me away because some of them, it's like, that started on the internet. I remember when that first got posted.
And so when I think of supernatural movies, of like the haunted house, like I mentioned, anything, really Vincent Price is fantabulous. But I also...
13 Ghosts is another one.
13 Ghosts, both versions. And most people don't know that there is an original version of 13 Ghosts. That it's just not the modern one, even though the modern one...
It's a cult classic that people really did not give it its due until nowadays.
I like both versions of 13 Ghosts. And I like them very much for different reasons. The original 13 Ghosts, being a black and white film, being done, I think it was in the late 50s, early 60s, around then. It didn't have the technology or the effects.
Just like the original House of Wax from the 30s didn't.
Exactly. And I'm not saying CGI effects. I'm just saying effects that could give it...
The practical effects in the 50s weren't there that if they had done the movie in the 70s would have been there.
There's some movies, like for The Haunting of Hill House. They had great effects there for Vincent Price. Now, with 13 Ghosts, that was done in the early 2000s. With Matthew Lillard and
Tony Shalhoub.
That was well done, and it was still all practical.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that I respect about it, that I think a lot of people don't give it credit. That entire movie was all practical, and if you got the DVD at that time, thankfully the Blu-ray brought it over, they actually had created stories for every single one of the 13 and had it on the extras as like this whole story for you to know about the craziness of those characters.
Yeah, it's just a shame we don't have the whole 108-minute cut. We only have the 90-minute cut on Blu-ray. Now, one movie that is one of my favorite horror movies, and it's another one that the studio's never actually given us a release of the true cut. Event Horizon is probably one of the best for sci-fi horror, body horror,
absolutely.
and psychological horror. It hits all three aspects in one.
Event Horizon, I enjoy sci-fi horror. I actually like The Abyss. A lot of people lean on that to be either like hard sci-fi or sci-fi horror.
I kind of consider it hard sci-fi for a James Cameron movie.
It is, but it has so many horror-ish elements. But Event Horizon is so incredible.
And if they had actually been able to pull off the whole H.P. Lovecraft story that inspired it, it could, without the studio interference, you can only be amazed on just how creepy it could have turned out to be.
And Lawrence Fishburne and Sam Neill did such a great job with that. That I was really, really, really impressed. Because it's very rare when you have, especially Lawrence Fishburne. I love Lawrence Fishburne, but he's not a huge horror actor. He plays it more straight.
He's a straight man in the movie, and a horror movie like that, you need the straight man, and that's his role for the movie.
Exactly. Where Sam Neill, who cut his teeth in horror with Omen 3, which it's a bad movie, but it exists. Unlike Chrysalis Bloodborne, I do acknowledge the bad movies in the series.
Well, and then Sam Neill went on to Jurassic Park, which in a way, going by the original novel, is sci-fi horror.
Now, when it comes to other movies that I really enjoy from the supernatural aspect, I have to admit I enjoy when they have fun with themselves as well. So I'm thinking, for example, Cabin in the Woods, because I think of that as a traditional.
It's a traditional horror movie that is a comedy at the same time.
Because technically it's a haunted house horror, because even though you have monsters in it, the monsters are all supernatural based.
And even though you have sci-fi in it, it's got a reason for it.
Exactly, and I appreciated it for what it was, because it took something that hasn't been done. There's very few horror movies that have actually good comedic elements.
Tucker and Dale versus Evil would be one of the other ones I would count in that.
I watched that movie twice before I convinced Kaiju to watch it. And when I convinced Kaiju to watch it, I think Silver Quill was over too. So I got like a 2-for-1 deal. But the reason why I'm so particular about horror with my things, because I'm not a huge fan of Southern comfort. And so for anyone who's not aware, I use the term, so do you and our friend Chris Lidge, the term SoCo or Southern Comfort Horror for like The Hills Have Eyes, Wrong Turn series.
Early Rob Zombie films with House of a Thousand Corpses.
They're basically on the edge of being torture porn and cannibal horror. And so I always call them Southern Comfort because even with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they all take place in like the middle of the South.
Whether it be the middle of Texas, the middle of Virginia, or it's usually the middle of somewhere in the Appalachians. Or
they're like super rednecky. You could also call definitely Southern Comfort redneck horror as well, because usually 9 times out of 10 all the horror movies have some creepy ass redneck coming into it. And I enjoy them.
Deliverance.
Oh God. There's so many movies that copy Deliverance. It's like reindeer games. But so the reason I'm not a huge fan of those is because I actually don't enjoy cannibal horror.
Which is something that I can very rarely watch.
Like, I would consider even Human Centipede, even though it's foreign horror, in that genre space. Because it's torture porn and cannibal all at the same time. Like, I'm not a huge fan of torture porn either. And when I think of torture porn, I'm thinking of like the Saw series.
Hostel,
pretty much almost anything Eli Roth has done. Half of what James Wan has done, because James Wan is a connoisseur when it comes to horror.
Connoisseur of everything from everywhere.
Oh God, he doesn't pick one genre of horror to take, because he helped with Lights Out, the Conjuring series.
He's admitted one of his favorite horror series is from Taiwan, Art of the Devil.
Oh yeah, that. Now, so I watch horror daily. This is admittedly a sickness of mine. And there are times I don't even know the titles of the movies I'm watching. I just see something that looks really cool and I'll put it on.
And where I like listening to psychological horror podcasts nowadays because I'm like, I don't have time to watch. I can have this as background noise, and I'm going, okay, that's freaking creepy. And these are stories on Chiller I'm listening to a lot of these podcasts on, and they're just stories that people have submitted to narrators, and the narrators read them. So you'll get some really bad ones or some really like, okay, dude, turn that short story into a novel.
There are some, so there's on Spotify, very similar to Chiller, there is this podcast I've listened to, Ghost Stories to Tell in the Dark. And some of those ghost stories, because they're submitted by, just like for Chiller, public, some of those ghost stories, I'm like, holy shit. I've had a hard time sleeping. Like, I can actually not listen to these ghost stories when I'm trying to fall asleep.
No, like me listening to alien abduction horror stories before I'm going to sleep.
I did it one time. I woke up freaked out. I think Kaiju, everybody knows his real name, but I thought Kaiju was going to kill me because I was freaked out. I'm like, oh my god, oh my god. So I've come to the conclusion, if I'm going to listen to anything going to sleep, it has to be true crime, which is horrific in and of itself, but
yeah, and then with me, when it comes to horror too, just whenever I'm trying to get into something new, it seems like I'm going the indie route like you are, but It's been more with just whatever catches my eye that's been H.P. Lovecraft inspired. I think what started that was just watching The Void. And The Void, just knowing it was made on a budget of $925,000 for the practical effects, it just floors me.
Well, it's fascinating. Like, I've even started watching some more queer horror. And for anyone who's not aware, queer horror has been around for a long, long time. You could actually say many of the Hammer film vampire movies were queer horror, especially when Dracula was Dracula's Daughters. Not White Zombie. Was it White Zombie? That was queer horror?
I think it's White Noise that was the queer horror.
There's a French film as well that got horribly edited in the U.S. or like a segment. I think it was part of Black Sabbath. I could be wrong. But where it was very focused on a lesbian relationship, but they butchered it when they brought it to the States because, the United States, we're prudes. But it's amazing how much more like queer horror is coming out there. Like, one is Mary, Mary, Bloody Mary. One I really liked was The Last Thing Mary Saw. If you ever get a chance to see that, it is really about a woman dealing with her family's death, or her grandmother's death, and it just takes this really crazy way of having her cope with this.
And with me, it's just been like, outside of the stuff I really enjoy when it comes to the psychological and the sci-fi aspect, it's like, I've been really diving more into what's been going with the podcasts or the indie stuff right now.
Well, indie is huge for me, and a lot of queer horror is indie, because one thing to be aware of, Hellraiser is queer horror.
Yep, and a lot of people don't realize that. with Clive Barker and his stuff until they've actually been a fan of his for years.
If you've read any of his books, you would know queer horror is huge for what he does.
Yeah. Oh, very much so. And in a way, you kind of can say the same thing, too, with some of the stuff Darren Astrofy's done with just the signaling he's done in the coding with Black Swan.
Well, Black Swan, Darren Aronofsky.
Yeah.
Yeah, who is a crazy, crazy, crazy human being. But, because if you think about it, even with Mother.
Yeah.
Mother was really out there. You have the same thing with...
Requiem for a Dream.
And when we talk about queer horror, we're not talking about just gay and lesbian movies. I think that's unfair because you have a lot of trans work, you have a lot of bisexual work out there that look at people in various forms of queerness.
Yeah.
Because both of us are queer, so we appreciate that.
And one movie that's kind of in that genre that people don't realize, Splice is considered a body horror and a queer horror movie at the same time.
Splice is so good. Well, and actually, one of the not oldest, because that's unfair, there's many, but one of the most underrated queer horror films is actually Nightmare on Elm Street 2.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that.
Because you have your first Scream Queen, who's a man. And if you ever want to learn about more of what it was like being the first male Scream Queen, there's actually a really good documentary on Shudder that the actor talks about how his experience was, of how he was essentially outed in a movie, and how it affected his career, his life, and everything like that.
Yeah. And the slasher genre is one that I've enjoyed, and you've enjoyed as well over the years, but we kind of just, at this point, just make fun of the camp that it's become.
Well, and see, why slasher is not considered my favorite, and it's not because I dislike slasher, it's exactly that. It has this campness that I appreciate, and...
Even Wes Craven, before his death, took the spin on it when he did Scream 4.
Scream 4 was an incredible way of mocking the remakes of so much of the slasher, because you've had remakes of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, remakes of so if you think about all the movies that really started horror in the 70s, you have a remake of Texas Chainsaw, a remake of Black Christmas, a remake of Friday the 13th, a remake of Halloween.
You had 2 remakes of Texas Chainsaw, technically.
Well, yes, you had 2 remakes. The first of the 2 remakes, which was actually done by Tobe Hooper, was great.
And then we have the Alba remake, which was terrible. And then there was The Tall Man, which is a remake of Phantasm.
Mm-hmm. And then... So when you have those, and then when you get into the 80s, I'm not going to go through all the slashers from the 80s because there's too many to tell, but hitting some of the hot points, you've had remakes of Nightmare on Elm Street, Evil Dead, Child's Play, those to name a few, or even The Thing, a remake of The Thing, and we watched all 3 of the Evil Dead trilogy. Evil Dead 1, Evil Dead 2, which is a soft reboot / sequel.
/ takes place in the parallel universe.
And then Army of Darkness. And it was amazing to watch the evolution of Sam Raimi, of his directing style. Because Evil Dead is great. I love the original Evil Dead. But Evil Dead 2 is like the best thing ever.
And the new Evil Dead that's coming to theaters next year has Sam Raimi's blessing and Bruce Campbell's blessing because it is a sequel to Army of Darkness and the TV show.
And so I appreciate how much they've done there. And
they built their own universe.
They really have. And those are movies that are supernatural, but they have slasherish elements in them.
They are psychological at the same time.
Well, yeah, especially when you get to, I would say more so for the first part of Evil Dead 2.
Before it starts turning into a horror comedy.
Because you have Ash really dealing with everything going on himself, that you're like, is it all in his head? Is it not? All of that going on. Yeah,
and Raimi's probably become the master of Raimi-isms in Hollywood because his movies are horror in multiple genres, but then they're comedies at the same time.
Yes, he doesn't take himself too seriously. It's one of the reasons why I like Drag Me to Hell. Drag Me to Hell, I know so many people who hate that movie.
But Dave, our friend Chris Lidge, myself, you, we all enjoy that movie because it's Raimi on his game, and he knew he was not going for an R rating for the movie. He even said that. He wanted to make it as psychologically traumatizing as possible, though.
Absolutely. And it's the perfect example of a haunted house movie. And I appreciate it because it took elements of what you expect from a haunted house, but also took elements of what I think of as pushing back against corporatism. Because really, if we didn't start the movie with the main actress not trying to think outside the box, we wouldn't have had the movie we had.
And apparently it was inspired by a story Sam Raimi read about a house that was apparently possessed here in Colorado Springs.
I'm not surprised. But I think also when you look at the type of horror that you enjoy, because I'm even thinking of like Kaiju's preference on horror. He likes, I would say more so than even you, the psychological. Because you like the psychological that has that spiritual element that still goes into the anti-realism.
And it's ones that just make your brain go. It's the kind of what I like to call the brain-breaking horror.
Yes. Whereas Kaiju loves psychological, but he prefers the psychological that are so fixed in reality. Like, for example, if you think about with Halloween, and if you only look at Halloween 2018 and Halloween Kills, it is pure, obviously there's certain elements of kills that don't make sense, but in all essence, it's pure madness. That is what's driving everything.
Look at John Carpenter's trilogy of The Thing, his Dracula film, The Prince of Darkness, and then, God, I can't think of the other.
In the
Mouth of Madness. They're all in that same vein.
Exactly. They're all movies that have that psychological element, but they're so well done factually that you're like, we could see this happening in real life. And because I look at Prince of Darkness as like this way of saying how technology is the sinner.
And in a way, what was considered John Carpenter's highlight before he came back with the Halloween reboot with producing it with Danny McBride, Vampires was considered his swan song because his next two movies were not that good.
Oh, Ghost of Mars was terrible.
And then The Ward.
The Ward was iffy. But Vampires is incredible. And Vampires is outside of his normal because it's so supernatural.
It's supernatural, but realistic supernatural at the same time.
Because when I also think of one of his movies, that's not technically horror, but it's more of a crime movie with Attack on Precinct 13. In a way, I think of it as like a horror-ish element because you are fighting against a monster even though it's man. Same thing with Escape from New York.
Yeah, because we don't talk about the other one.
No, that's one of the ones that I won't acknowledge. But so I see him gravitating always towards certain directors and certain creators because they do something that holds an element of truth. And I think that's where I come from in the like horror raised me to be who I am. Because I've always been Wiccan. I've always believed in the supernatural. I've always believed in things are not always as they've seen. Some people may mock that, but I've always believed that there's more to this universe than there is.
Well, for me, look at where I grew up in the middle of freaking mountains. So I know there's stuff out there that I can't explain. And I don't want to really ever share the story of something that happened to me in the woods because it's a little traumatizing because I was by myself. And at the same time, there's people that would not take it seriously out there.
Well, and I think that's where it comes from when we gravitate towards certain things. Because you really gravitate towards that supernatural, psychological, and almost science fiction in a way. Or science fantasy. Where I definitely have always gravitated to things that do live on the cusp of reality and super worldly or otherworldly, where kaiju, I've known this for all the years that we've been together and I respect it, but he is definitely of the mindset of living in reality. He's agnostic, so he'll believe it when he sees it type thing. So I feel like we are raised by how we are, because I even think of our other friend Ron, with his interest in horror from our conversations. He utilizes horror as like an escapism, which I find fascinating because it really is. If anybody watched horror to be true to life, I think we'd all be sociopaths and serial killers. But utilizing it as an escapism, I think works perfectly.
Well, like me, he grew up in that same area of the mountains that's kind of isolated, and there's things that go bump in the night there that we just can't explain, and it does not make sense.
I lived across the street from a railroad, and I learned very quickly that being in an area that has like a lot of history, because of where I live, just like with you in the mountains, there's many things I've seen. Yeah,
the biggest thing with growing up in the mountains, if it goes quiet, the birds aren't chirping, the insects aren't making any noise, something's wrong.
And I honestly can say for me, I can't live without silence. I can't live in silence. So I have to have ambient noise. But that's kind of why I still enjoy horror. Because, don't get me wrong, horror movies, any of the horror movies I watch, there are times they scare me to death. But I'd rather be afraid by what's in the movie than have to think about what I fear in reality.
Yeah, and that's what it is. I think because of what I know, and the few things I actually do scare the crap out of me is what has led me down some of the horror tastes I have. Though the body horror, I just think is just my desensitization has got me to go, okay, how far can I take my enjoyment of this?
Well, yeah, I think we all have a level of being desensitized. I honestly have to say, because I'm so emphatic, it's hard for me to be truly desensitized to everything because my brain doesn't work that way. That's why I'm so jealous of you. But I do enjoy body horror, especially anything Cronenberg related, because Cronenberg has a great way of weaving an incredible story in his body horror.
Yes.
So it's not just seeing a grotesque situation like with The Fly or even with Videodrome.
Yeah, Lars Vartarven, that French director, has a way of making it go, okay, seeing a human skinned alive is creeping me out, but at the same time, I can't look away.
Exactly. So things like that I'm fine with because of the fact that the story makes it palatable. That's why I don't watch like Human Centipede or all of the Hostel series. I've seen the first one. I don't watch those because for me, there's also that element of realistic fear of knowing there's crazy ass people out there who would do that.
Hostel 2, the Elizabeth Bathory.
Well, and so for me, Hostel is the reason that if I travel internationally, I will stay at a really nice hotel. I don't care if I am dropping a ton of money for a place to stay. I will not stay in a public place. So horror is also at the end.
A PSA.
It's a perfect PSA of what not to do. If you want to see what's on the other side, you do not go to an ancient burial ground. If you see a new housing community being built, question, was there ever a graveyard there?
If you're in the woods alone, question where you're camping.
Exactly. And if somebody calls a place a suicide forest, there is a reason for that, and you don't go in there.
And with that, we'll be wrapping up this month with just talking about some of the indie stuff we have actually come across and give some shout out to some creators we have discovered.
Absolutely. There's a lot of great indie creators who have done things that we feel need to be recognized. And yes, we're a little old podcast, so it's not like they're probably going to see much of us, but we still think that's important to acknowledge and hopefully get you engaged in watching some really great cinema or listening to some fun podcasts or even reading some incredible books, because indie does not necessarily mean a movie. It means things that are done that are so different and out of the ordinary.
Or they're independently published, or they're just been put out there because somebody is doing a project and it's a passion for themselves.
And just think, heavy metal is still the most popular independently published magazine.
And it's been running since 1976, and they now have their own money to fund their own live-action Hulu TV series.
Which I'm afraid of. But with that said, thank you very much for listening and have an awesome rest of your Halloween month. Bye!